So many of the British newspapers are leading with the story. It's been described as an ordinary house in an ordinary London street, but it's claimed 3 women were held here for 30 years against their will. Facts are continuing to emerge, and it's led many people to question how this apparent slavery can happen in 21st century London. We'll be speaking to guests in London, in Berlin and in Bristol here in the UK. Plus, we'll talk to Saudis and Ethiopians about a crackdown on illegal foreign workers, which has seen protests, deaths and thousands leave the Saudi capital. Already many of you are getting in touch with us on Facebook and on Twitter, but you can also pick up the phone or send us an email.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Well, it's good to have you with us here on World Have Your Say. As I said, many of the newspapers here in the UK leading with that slavery story. One of them here we can pull up from the independent newspaper, London's Shame, the women freed after 30 years of slavery. And many people questioning whether it's the culture of the way we live in London that is really at the heart of this problem. Let me introduce you to a number of guests who are with us to talk about this story. Tim Dickens is editor of the Brixton Blog and Bugle newspaper here in London. Alan Hall is a writer in Berlin, and Mark Ovenden is a survivor of modern-day slavery who joins us on the line from Bristol. Well, Mark, it makes sense to start by speaking to you. Just tell us what happened to you.
Back in 2009, towards the middle of 2009, I fell on hard times. I was living in a house that was due to be sold. I had no money in my pocket, so I was at risk of homelessness. And I was stopped in the street by a gentleman in a fairly nice car. He had his wife and his kid with him, who offered me a job and a place to live, 3 meals a day. So it all sounded ideal, and I agreed to go with him. He agreed to pay me £40 a day. It quickly transpired that things weren't exactly as he told them to me. I ended up working for up to 19 hours a day for no pay. While nothing really terrible physically was done to me, I saw a lot of violence going on to other workers around me. There were perhaps 15 other people at the same site. We were eventually taken over to Sweden, where we were laying driveways much as we've done in the UK, and were eventually rescued by the Swedish police.
Many people listening to your story will be horrified that something like that can happen in the UK. Was it a gradual drip, or did this suddenly happen to you? I just wonder why you weren't able to leave.
I found myself eventually quite far from home. We were just outside of London. I'm from Bournemouth. So for a start, it would have been very, very difficult for me to get back with no money in my pocket, with not knowing the local area. I was also forbidden to leave the site, and I'd seen other people sort of escape, and they were always brought back to the site in a far worse state than they'd left. So there's that constant threat of violence hanging over you, and with those circumstances, you just don't feel able to escape. And obviously, towards the end of my experience, I was on the continent. It's not particularly easy to just walk home from Sweden. So that was a factor as well.
So when you read about this story that emerged yesterday of these 3 women being held in London, they say for 30 years in what's been described as an ordinary house on an ordinary street, did that surprise you?
It's certainly shocking, but I can't say I'm particularly surprised. It's far more widespread than people are aware of. I like to tell people that within 10 miles of where they're sat, there's a similar case to the one we're hearing about today. It's very, very widespread.
Well, let's bring in Tim Dickens, who's editor of the Brixton Blog and Bugle newspaper in London. And Tim, I spoke to you last night on World Service Radio. I know that you've been out speaking to people in the area. We don't know exactly which street, which house this occurred in, but we do know that it's in the Lambeth area of South London. Just tell people what neighbours, what people in the local area have been telling you.
Yeah, well, as you say, we were out talking to people in their homes and on the streets of Lambeth last night, and again this morning. And the overwhelming reaction was one of absolute shock that this could have happened in our community, right under people's noses in modern day Britain, let alone Lambeth and an area that sort of is quite known for its good sense of community, really.
Well, let's bring in Alan Hall. I know that you've written about these kind of subjects numerous times. Is that a key, that these kind of things can happen anywhere, right under people's noses, with little knowledge?
Of course, hiding in plain sight, I call it. I just completed a book about Ariel Castro in America, who kept 3 women slaves in his house for over 10 years. And his house is in the city of Cleveland. The street itself, it's an impoverished area, many people on welfare, food stamps, a lot of domestic fights. The police visited this street 1,000 times and over the 10-year period, but nobody ever thought to ask Ariel Castro why his windows were covered with polythene sheeting and why he shopped for 4 people and he lived alone. It's an atomization of society, really. The more connected we are with 24/7 news, iPads, internet, the more remote we seem to become to one another. And I think that it just boils down to people just don't want to get involved.
Tom, working in London, do you think this is about, sorry Tim, is it about people not wanting to get involved? Is it about people being busy? Or is it just, as one of my colleagues said, who's lived in London for 25 years, come from Australia, said that actually it's quite a cold city?
Yeah, I know that Lambeth is part of central London and South London, and it can be, to outsiders, an incredibly cold place. There are so many people living so closely, especially where we are in Lambeth. It's got one of the highest population densities, I think, in the UK. So people are living right next to each other, and they just often don't know their neighbours. If you don't know people that live next door to you, there's no reason necessarily why you'd introduce yourself and speak to them. And that's maybe something in London and other cities we kind of shy away from, which is a massive shame. Like I said before, luckily we're quite lucky in Lambeth. There is a sense of community spirit where we are in Brixton. We have a lot of sort of street parties and the community does come together. But I think this case has shown, really sadly, that's not always the case, and people don't know who's living next door to them and what's going on.
Well, comments are coming in all of the time. Boris Johnson has just made this comment: if it's bad as it would appear, then it's deplorable that something like this can happen in the 21st century, let alone in London, the greatest city on earth. That is, of course, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. Alan Hall, is it fair to say this is London's shame, as the newspapers are saying? Is this a shame that just London should bear? No,
not at all. Castro was in Cleveland, Joseph Fritzl was in a town called Amstetten in Austria, Natascha Kampusch was in Vienna. These are 2 big cities and 1 big town, and it can happen anywhere. And the police say there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like this still waiting to be discovered. It's not London's shame at all. It may have been exacerbated by the fact it's a great big conurbation, but as I say, these people hide in plain sight. They rely in a way for the ordinary members of the public to become their silent accomplices, because they're too busy worrying about their mortgages, they're too busy worrying about getting the kids to school, they're too busy getting through their day. And often when these cases are discovered, like the Castro one in America or like the Fritzl one, people turn around and say, oh yes, wasn't that strange? Do you remember when we heard that? Do you remember when we saw that? But they didn't act at the time. And I think that's the malaise of society, that's the community spirit that needs to return, is where we start thinking of one another again.
Mark, as a survivor yourself of modern day slavery, what sort of interaction did you have with the people who lived around you?
Well, we were working on people's driveways, so we were in fairly regular contact with members of the public. I mean, we were working for homeowners. I would say certainly there's an element of people not wanting to be involved, but then a larger part of the problem is that people are simply unaware of what goes on. They're not sure of what signs they should be looking for. They're not, they just don't know that this happens. So I think a big aspect of kind of combating this sort of thing is to make the public more aware that it goes on, so that if somebody sees something unusual like both of your guests just described, they are able to say, is this a case of slavery? Is there something slightly fishy going on here?
Let's bring in Kate Roberts, who's a community worker for a charity, Cala in London. Kate, welcome to World Have Your Say. I know that your charity works with people who have survived these kind of ordeals. Were you surprised to hear that something like this could happen in London in the 21st century?
Well, at Cala we work with migrant domestic workers in the UK, many whom have been brought to the UK and are kept in conditions of slavery. And unfortunately, we do see people coming to our centre on a regular basis alleging abuse. So we've not come across anything of the length of these allegations, but we do see shocking abuse of migrant domestic workers in the UK, and we're glad to have the opportunity to raise awareness of the issue.
Do you think there is sufficient awareness amongst whether it's government agencies, the police? I wonder if each of you would answer this. Kate first. Do you think there is enough awareness?
Well, I think that there isn't, in short. I think people believe it can't happen and doesn't happen, and often I think domestic workers' stories aren't believed. Certainly in the case of migrant domestic workers who we see at Calais Anne, many are too fearful to come forward, and I think people, if they do approach anyone on the street, a neighbour for example, they often wouldn't know where to go and how to help them. Migrant domestic workers, the people we see at Calais Anne, have recently had the rules of their visa changed in April 2012, since which time they have been tied to their employer and actually prohibited from changing employer, even to escape abuse. So it's hard to say actually what a member of the public would do to help someone in their situation. Even when they come to Calais Anne, the help we can give them is limited. We can refer them as a victim of trafficking into the national referral mechanism, but many are too fearful for us to do that, because we also have to explain the immigration rules to them and the fact that their visa does tie them to their employer.
Mark, I could see you nodding when Kate was talking.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of too many of these cases, I think, are treated as immigration issues, which makes the victim perhaps a little wary to go to the authorities. And there were, I've heard a lot of cases this year alone of people kind of going to police stations to report that they've been exploited and being arrested by the police as illegal immigrants, which is, I mean, the mind boggles. That shouldn't be going on. I know that there's a lot of training going on for police officers. There's a programme here in Bristol, in fact, led by Unseen, another organisation who deal with this, and they're doing excellent work, but it needs to be rolled out across the country. It needs to be obligatory.
Alan?
I think there's a distinction to be made between economic slaves and people who vanish, people who are taken by sexual predators. We don't really know yet the full story behind these three people. The only thing I have read is that there wasn't a sexual motive to it. So the question is, what was the motive? It doesn't seem to me that these people in this house in Lambeth were economic slaves. So really, I think the two do fall into two different camps: the people that are taken by the monsters among us, if you like, and the people that are exploited by gang masters like Mark was.
Well, do stay with us, because we've got lots more to talk about this on World Have Your Say, and so many facts still emerging, and I think this is something that we'll carry on talking about for many weeks or months to come. Stay with us and we'll keep talking in the next few minutes.
No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something. No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say, where we're discussing the story coming out of London in the last 24 hours that 3 women say they've been held for more than 30 years in a house in South London. We're speaking to Tim Dickens, editor of the Brixton Blog and Bugle newspaper in London, Alan Hall, who's a writer in Berlin, and Mark Ovenden, who's a survivor of modern-day slavery. Mark, over the last 24 hours since this story broke, so many people have been getting in touch saying, why didn't people feel the need to walk out? Why is it, what's the emotional hold that your captors have over you? I know you talked about the fear of violence, but talk to us a little bit about that emotional struggle and the hold they have over you.
It's extremely difficult to leave. You become, in every sense, completely dependent on your employer, if you can call them that, your exploiter. You depend on them for your shelter, you depend on them for food, for any money that you might be getting. So in a sense, I guess you start to sympathise with them. It sounds really, really twisted. I'm aware of how it sounds, but that's how you end up. There were guys who I was working with who'd been there for 15 years. They've been working for these guys for 15 years, which is a period of time I can't even imagine. And they, after the police had liberated them, they went back to the site and defended these guys. So they have that kind of a hold on you. You're just gradually kind of ground down. You're made to feel like that's where you're meant to be, that there is no escape, there's no way you're getting out, and that's your life.
And these other workers who were there, you mentioned those who were there for 15 years. When your captors weren't around, did you discuss ever trying to escape?
Yes, but it was all very abstract. We knew that there was no way that we were going to get out, that we knew that, you know, if we were to just get up and walk down the street, we'd be taken back, or we'd go to the authorities and we wouldn't be believed. So there really was no way to escape. I wasn't aware that I could get out of it until the Swedish police contacted me and told me that they knew what was going on, and that they wanted to offer me a way out. But before that, it never really actually occurred to me to run away.
And one of the other questions that's been coming into us at World Have Your Say is, what about your family? Weren't you missed?
I have a very odd relationship with family. I'm not particularly close to them and haven't been since sort of the age of 16. So they, as far as I'm aware, they weren't too concerned that I was missing.
Is this a similar story that you hear, Alan? Is this the sort of classic case, if you like, of people who are victims of this or survivors of this?
No, absolutely. It sounds to me like Mark suffered, even perhaps marginally, but from the Stockholm Syndrome, the phrase attached to the people who bond with their captors and have an empathy with them. He was, how long were you captive, Mark? 2 years, did you say?
No, it was roughly 9 months.
9 months, okay. Well, the Stockholm Syndrome was coined for bank raid hostages in Stockholm in the 70s who were captives for a matter of days. So if you multiply that by you were 9 months, well, Elizabeth Fritzl was 24 years, and these ladies for 30 years, you can imagine how much fear they felt, and how much, as absolutely you said, that you bond with these people, you come to rely on them, and you feel sympathy for them even. So these are all things, we've not walked in these people's shoes, we can't know, but I've spoken to enough psychiatrists over the years in the 3 cases, Kampusch, Fritzl and Castro, to know that these women have years of therapy ahead of them. The only good thing one could say is that they took the courage to make a call which indicates they had optimism about a future life away from these people. So one hopes they can construct something from that, but there's no one-size-fits-all cure for them.
Mark, you're nodding.
Absolutely, no, I agree completely. It would have been an extremely difficult decision to make, in fact, to walk out that door and to the police after 30 years. I mean, I was only there for 9 months, and you know, the police got in touch with us, and at first we didn't know whether we could trust them. We didn't know whether we could talk to them or how much we could tell them, and so initially, in fact, we didn't cooperate. It was only after kind of sitting back for 2 days and discussing what we've been told that we agreed between us that that was the best way out, and that was the only real offer of help that we'd received. And so we left, but it was a very, very difficult decision to make.
And if you take the case of Natasha Kampusch, she was once stopped in her captor's car by a policeman. There's an armed officer leaning into the car with a gun on his belt, and she still kept quiet. So there you have the degree to which these people impose their will upon their captives.
Let's bring Kate Roberts back in from the charity Kalyan, who was listening to that, and I know that you were nodding throughout, Kate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, in the case of the migrant domestic workers who we see at Kalyan, some have been physically locked in the house, but many haven't been physically locked in. They've been forbidden from leaving, and it's for similar reasons. However, in the case of migrant domestic workers, there is the added factor that many don't speak English. They don't have their passports. They've had nothing to do with coming to the UK. Their journey has been controlled throughout, and they've basically been brought to a house and kept in that house. So they know that if they left, they would not know where to go, and they're very scared of leaving, often because of what their employers have told them. As I mentioned, since April 2012, the overseas domestic worker visa on which they've been brought has forbidden them from changing employers. They breach the immigration rules when they leave, and their employers use that and tell them that and explain to them that if they leave, they are breaking the law, and tell them the police will be after them, rather than them understanding that actually it's the employers who are the criminals. So often when we see domestic workers at Kalyan, they genuinely believe that they are the ones who are in trouble for having left their situation of abuse.
And Mark, when we hear your story, the story that Kate shares with us there, how difficult was it for you to rebuild your life? You say you were lucky you were only there for 9 months, but you've also talked about that emotional hold they had over you. So how did you begin to rebuild?
Initially, I was very fearful, actually, that there were going to be recriminations. I was working for a fairly large family, and I was aware that the police hadn't by any means arrested all of the family. So for a short while, for a few months, I'd say, I was quite worried. I was constantly looking over my shoulder for something to happen. But I was extremely lucky in that I walked out of that situation into kind of a ready-made support network. I was in Sweden, but I started volunteering at a little anarchist-run vegan cafe, and made a lot of friends there who made me feel very safe and made me feel like a normal person again. And it was that, I think, that I needed, kind of that, you know, to sever my ties with the people who've been exploiting me, to go back out into society and be like everyone else again. But it took a long time. It's been 3 years now since all of that happened to me, and I'd say I'm pretty much okay now, but it has taken 3 years to get to this point.
Let's pull up this comment, which has come in to us from Eric in Accra. He sent the message on WhatsApp. He says, life in London is very weird. There's no such thing as extended family. Lots of people live in isolation. I've lived in South London for some time without knowing my neighbours. And he also said that in Africa, even when someone doesn't have cable, for example, you can walk into your neighbour's house, you can watch a game, all these ways of living open doors, and you know who your neighbour is. We've brought back in Tim Dickens, editor of the Brixton Blog and Bugle newspaper in London. And Tim, this essentially is what it boils down to, doesn't it? In London, we live, we don't necessarily know our neighbours, we don't keep an eye out for each other. But is there any way that's ever going to change?
I don't know. I was just thinking, if there's one positive thing that could come out of this awful story that's sort of emerging at the moment, is that people we've been speaking to have sort of said, this has made me think about who lives around me and the community around me, because if this can happen on a street in Lambeth, you know, it could be my street, it could be next door. So perhaps locally in Lambeth and across London, it's making people aware of what's around them and thinking about how they do interact with their neighbours and their community. We have a huge immigrant, one of the biggest immigrant communities in the UK, I think, in Lambeth. So there are probably a lot of people who are feeling in a similar situation to your contributor there.
I guess the thing is, Tim, I look back to London 2012 and how the Olympic effects and how people suddenly started talking to each other on the tube, smiling at one another, and everyone was like, wow, is this a new thing for London? A few months later, we all went back to our old ways, and I guess that's the danger. There may be vigilance now, but there's a concern, Kate Roberts, isn't there, that in a few months people may not be interested anymore?
Possibly, but I also think it is about people not knowing what they can do to help. There's a lady I registered at Callia Ann who really horrified me by telling me that although she was in domestic servitude, she had to take the children out to the park, to the playground very regularly. And she was often not dressed properly. She was dressed in clothes that were too cold for the weather, yet she was going to a playground in a middle-class area on a regular basis, and for months, for a long period of time. And I asked her if anyone ever approached her and asked if she was okay, and she said no. And then she said that she once asked for help. She'd approached a mum in the playground with her children and said, "Would you help me?" And the woman replied, "I'm sorry, I don't have any time. I'm very busy right now."
Kate, that is so difficult for so many people to hear, and certainly something that makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Kate, thank you for joining us. Tim, thank you also to Mark. Well, do stay with us. Lots more to talk about here on World Have Your Say. If you want to add your thoughts on that, facebook.com/World Have Your Say.
Let's just say something.
Welcome back. A crackdown on illegal foreign workers in Saudi Arabia has resulted in rioting and deaths, with numerous videos being uploaded to the internet claiming to show violence by both sides. Stay with us here on World Have Your Say as we speak to Saudis and Ethiopians.
Talking about it.
Top priority.
I experienced.
Is this what? Is this the case? People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Well, thank you for being with us here on World Have You Say. So many of you getting in touch with us from Saudi Arabia, Ghana, India, Nigeria, Uganda, Somalia, the US and France. If you're on Twitter, you can speak to us using the hashtag WHYS. Well, let me introduce you to a couple of guests who are going to speak about the situation in Saudi Arabia. Zelalem is a human rights campaigner in London and Fasil is editor at ESAT TV in Amsterdam. Welcome both of you. Zelalem, first of all, from your perspective in London, what are the sort of stories that you're hearing coming out of Saudi Arabia at the moment about the treatment of foreign workers?
Well, about the treatment of foreign workers, is what we're hearing is basically following the crackdown of people who have got some documents and who don't have documents. There is sort of mistreatment, as in by security forces and some vigilantes who are running around, mainly Ethiopians, and well, there are a number of deaths, a few sort of gang rapes, and thousands of people who are basically have been detained in a remote location where like food or water supply is, well, not to say adequate, but sort of hardly there is any, and the reports that we're getting from there is really not pleasant at the moment.
Well, I just want to pull up a video which has been shared online a lot. I'll warn you that it does contain some quite graphic content, but we'll pull it up now. It's a video that more than 400,000 people have seen on YouTube in the last week. It's called Hell on Earth, Ethiopians in Saudi Arabia and the barbarism perpetrated against them by Saudis. It features footage of what are being presented as beatings of Ethiopians by Saudis and graphic images of what appears to be a dead body. We're not going to show you that image. Now, we can't confirm the footage. We can't say whether it is what it says it is. There are lots of videos online claiming that this footage is false or indeed old, but we're showing it because it does actually demonstrate the story which people are trying to tell us about this issue online. There are many counter videos being uploaded showing very different things. Let's bring in Fasil, who's editor at ESAT TV in Amsterdam. And Fasil, you uploaded this video onto your site. Tell us why you believe that it is authentic.
We believe it's authentic because we interview people on the spot. There are a number of Ethiopians who are willing to speak about the plight in Saudi Arabia. So they also send us via our address and some footage. For instance, today I received a footage, mothers asking the international community to rescue them, begging for Ethiopians and the rest of the world to urge the Saudi government and the Ethiopian government to relieve them from the problem now they are carrying. So we confirm on various aspects, also other international media, like the DW Deutsche Welle Radio and Voice of America, also interview so many people, and I think the issue is uncontestable at this moment. There is a gross human rights violation, and I don't think that the government itself, the government of Saudi Arabia itself, denies the reality there.
Well, Fasil, it's worth saying that there are many other videos uploaded online which pull apart this video, saying that it's old footage or it's footage that has been filmed in Lebanon. As I say, the BBC can't possibly verify whether it is authentic or not. But Fasil, how about the general idea? Go on, Fasil, respond to that.
You are a big international organizations, including BBC, other international media. You have the financial access, you have the political leverage to go and actually find out the truth there. I don't know why the BBC has failed to report facts on the ground. You have that. We don't have access to go to Saudi Arabia and interview all these kind of people. We are a very small companies, but the BBC and other international media can go and verify the facts there. They can go and check. And I don't know why the BBC and other international media have failed to do so until now, until this sort of human rights. Thousands of people are being concentrated in deportation camps.
Fasil, I think we have to accept that the BBC, of course, is a massive organisation. It is something that, of course, would be investigated, but it's very difficult to verify these kind of videos which are coming in when they have not been filmed by BBC correspondents or indeed cameramen. There's only so much we can do to see if they are indeed authentic. But Fasil, do you think that do you appreciate what the Saudi Arabian authorities are trying to do? They are trying to get more Saudis into employment. When you look at more than half of the working age people in Saudi Arabia are not in employment, can you respect that what they're trying to do is get more of their own people in work and ask illegal foreign workers to leave the country?
Well, it is the right of the Saudi government to deport people who are considered maybe illegal in their own eyes. It is their national right. That's the sovereignty right of the Saudi government. But it doesn't have a right to abuse the rights of the deportees, the right of quote-unquote illegal workers. Because look, raping, abducting people and dispossessing people, it's not written in any law in the world. So what the Saudi government is doing is not only deporting people, it's abusing their basic human rights, and that's what I don't subscribe to it. And I think the international community has to intervene to stop this gross human rights violation. Otherwise, it's right. It has to treat them in a very humane way. But what we observe on the ground and what we hear is something that that violates all international laws.
Let's bring in Kamalila, who is an HR consultant in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Thank you for joining us on World Have Your Say. We've been hearing from Zalilam and Fasil about the problems that foreign workers have had in your country. Tell me your experiences with foreign workers.
I'm a Saudi, and my experience with foreign workers are, I think it's a media issue as well. It's been taken out of context. And what you clearly said earlier on is very important, that we have a huge unemployment problem in Saudi Arabia. I don't like to go into all these human rights things, but anywhere around the world, we have a lot of you have illegal immigrants. You have this problem in the UK. You have it in Europe as a whole. So we have a problem with illegal immigrants in Saudi Arabia. Now, it has been ignored for such a long time. And I think it's time, with the unemployment, with the political situation, with the pressures in the region, I think it's time that the government had to do something aggressive. Now, some of the things are a bit heavy-handed because these people were not trained in how to handle such an incident and such a situation. But nevertheless, it is something necessary for the country.
Zalalam, do you want to speak to her?
Yeah, I think that probably, I don't know if it's something that we can really subscribe to, because first of all, the type of job that these immigrant people are doing are low-level jobs, which sort of native Saudis are not interested in. The second thing is, regardless of whether you are trained or not, there is a basic principle as to what you would do to a human being. Okay, taking someone's life by any standard is not something that you need to be trained or not to be trained for. And if they are illegal immigrants, there is a due process. Okay, you can't repatriate them. You can take them from where they came from. Well, to begin with, the way these people are brought into the country and through the sponsorship and the agency and the employment itself is sort of provides as if they own these people. They can do anything to them, okay? Not just as employers and employee relationship. They have got no protection to the extent of being used for all sort of physical mistreatments and even to let their angers out on them. Nothing sort of related to them. We've received a video. I mean, I'll leave the contact numbers and the video with your colleagues here. A lady who have been serving in a house have been hanged up upside down, and she's been beaten in turns by the whole family. How is that acceptable in this day and age?
Camelia, you're shaking your head.
This is, okay, these are rare cases. It's not the majority. It's not what's happening across the country. So, of course, there are always rare cases, just like the slavery case that you just talked about earlier in London. But this is not the overwhelming case with maids in Saudi Arabia. In fact, we have had many cases in Saudi Arabia of the housekeepers or the maids, whatever nationality, of them being abusive or mishandling the property or the children or attacking members of the family. So I don't think we should look at it so naively and just from a purely human rights point of view.
Fasil, do you want to respond?
Specific case about this. Look, we are talking about thousands of people now camped in deportation camps. So if you are talking about thousands of people, it can represent what kind of system established in Saudi Arabia. So I don't think that it's a specific case. It appears across the nation. So we are talking about thousands of people, not about a handful of people.
Camelia? Camelia, would you like to respond?
We have a huge immigration and unemployment problem. We have approximately we have less than 70%, more than 70% of the population under the age of 25, 26. We need to find jobs for our own people. That's one point of view. Another thing is a lot of these people are illegal immigrants. They have no visas. We're not talking about the people who illegally came into the country. We're talking about people either illegally who came to the country or people who came legally in and then they ran away from their sponsors. And the sponsors have paid thousands and thousands to manage to get them in employment. And within months, there's a lot of organized crime. And there's within months, a maid or a usually the maids more than the drivers, they run away and they have these preset organizations and underground organizations going on. So the government has to do something about it. And I don't think any country in the world would tolerate such a situation either.
Well, I don't think she's trying to justify what's unjustifiable. If you are a person, first of all, you are a legal person. These people are legal to the Ethiopian people, to the Ethiopian nation. So whether they have that passport or not, they should be treated as a human being first. And then they should be treated in a humane way. What we see is if they are illegal, then you are not entitled to abuse their rights. That's what's happening in Saudi Arabia. In the name of illegality, now their rights is being abused. And that's unacceptable, let alone in laws, but to morality itself.
Camelia?
I'm just listening to him. Okay. The way things have been managed, I may agree with you. It is a little bit rough, and they haven't been trained properly on how to manage this because it happened suddenly. Now, as a country as a whole, we have a lot of issues with management and training and development, and particularly with the Ministry of Interior. So I agree with you. The way it's been handled, it could have been done better. But it is a necessary move. They couldn't have waited to train people and train the officers and train the military and then done this. It was an urgent situation. So I'm sorry. I mean, a lot of the illegal immigrants, they've suffered a lot more getting into Saudi Arabia through Africa or through Yemen or wherever, however else they came into the country than whatever could possibly happening to them now. And they're just being put into camps. And I agree with you. It's not the ideal situation. But, nothing is perfect. What's happening in Europe? How are they handling the immigrants in Europe who are landing from Africa into Europe?
Well, Camelia, you talk about those figures for unemployment in Saudi Arabia. Official figures put them at around 12%, but most people acknowledge that it's much more than that. Many estimates putting it around half of working age people in Saudi Arabia are not employed. The government there is trying to improve that situation by tightening up something that they've overlooked for many years and the papers of migrant workers. Let's pull up this video, which comes from Saudi Arabia. It appears to show a group of Ethiopians protesting in Saudi Arabia. They're going through the various ethnic groups which come from the country and they're chanting, "We are one." Well, Zelalem, your response, I mean, rowdy protests, we've seen many protests. Do you accept that some of them have been violent?
Well, I don't know about being violent. The bit that we don't see is what's really made them to get into this situation. Okay, these are people, there is a huge mismatch between the situation that they're brought into the country and what they're facing on the ground, even for documented people I'm talking about. And these are people who have sort of been sponsored or been smuggled through some sort of international routes in which some Saudi agencies themselves are involved in and promised that they would be provided employment and all that after paying so much money. And well, these are the lucky ones who have made it. The other ones are probably sort of have been victims of the sea or the desert. And after that, all of that, and they come into a situation where what they have been done in terms of mistreatment is so sort of pouring out and basically stripping them out of dignity. For them, there is nothing left apart from fighting for their own survival. I mean, it's human instincts. When you are in a foreign land, you would be a nice person. This is not, well, even to mention, there is an isolated case where foreign employees are doing this and doing that to their owners and to sort of masters is really, I mean, it doesn't wash a lot, okay? It's human instinct. You would be subversive, okay? But what is true on the ground is that there is little protection about these people's life, not even just employment, about life and sort of lively situations.
As you're speaking, I can see Camilla shaking her head ferociously, but we're going to take out a quick break. Lots of you watching around the world getting in touch with us. A viewer from the Philippines who lives in Saudi Arabia has got in touch via WhatsApp. Companies are forced to employ illegal immigrants. Saudis want to only work in offices and drink tea and coffee. This is the reality. I've lived here for 12 years. Do stay with us on World Have You Say.
No, I absolutely talking about it. But let me say something. No, I absolutely talking about it. But let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Camelia was desperate to respond to the points that were made just before the break, but before we allow her to do so, I want to pull up this video which has come in from, well, it's from YouTube. It claims to show Ethiopian women and children waiting to leave Saudi Arabia. They say that they're cold, the place they're in is overflowing. They claim to have been abandoned by their government, something that the government denies. But it's worth saying the BBC can't verify whether these pictures are indeed from Saudi Arabia or even whether this is a camp where they're being detained or whether those women and children are there of their own free will. But it really gives you a sense of the online battles that are being played out. People sharing so many videos showing many different things. Let's go back to Camelia, who's an HR consultant in Jeddah. And I know that, Camelia, you wanted to respond to Zalalem's claims just before the break.
Just a few comments. You know, these people who have been in Saudi Arabia for years and being sent back home now, they've been earning a lot of money. On average, a maid in Saudi Arabia or a driver earns between 1,500 Saudi riyals to 3,000 Saudi riyals per month. And that's with food being paid, with lodgings being paid, often clothes are being given, and, you know, regular hours of work. So this is the overwhelming majority, which is really the reason why they're here in the first place, why they've stayed here for so long. And a lot of money is being sent back home. Over all these years, they've managed probably to set themselves off properly back home. They probably managed to have a home or whatever.
Well, Camelia, I hope you'll forgive me for jumping in, because I want to allow Faisal to respond to that briefly, if you would, because we're right up against it.
Well, I think there is this paradox regarding the economy of Saudi Arabia, because I read from Saudi Gazette on March 80, 2012, that Ethiopian housemaids have been high in demand after the kingdom stopped recruiting housemaids from 4 countries, including Kenya, it says. And the Vice Consul for Economic Affairs in Jeddah says the following, look, we decided to finish procedures of 1,500 housemaids due to the increasing demand for Ethiopian housemaids by Saudi families. And Ethiopian housemaid's are trained well on Saudi customs and traditions. Besides, the percentage of runaway is low.
And Faisal, I'm going to have to jump in, and I hope you will forgive me. Camelia and Faisal, I have a feeling, could be talking about this for many, many minutes to come. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be back at the same time next week.
Let me say something.